let's talk about IHSS now. Let's talk about getting protective supervision for a very young child. Obviously, as an advocate, that's the specialty that IHSS Advocates engages in. We focus on getting protective supervision for children who are extremely young. There was a time when IHSS was first initiated where children were not considered to be part of the population that would be allowed to get protective supervision, and it was commonplace at one point in time for social workers to deny without actually doing assessments. And it wasn't until 1998 when Garrett versus Anderson was a superior court made a decision. It was actually a stipulated decision creating rules for assessing minors for protective supervision. And some of the highlights from that court decision, which are found in all Can Letter 98-87, include that a social worker should always assess an IHSS eligible minor for mental functioning, and not to presume that a minor of any age has a mental functioning score of 1, which would be no impairment. A social worker must evaluate a mentally impaired minor in the functions of memory, orientation, and judgment. A social worker must assess a minor's need for protective supervision if the minor has a mental impairment. So if you've got regional center, for example, or you've got an IEP at school and it states on there that there is a mental impairment, well, that is in writing sufficient reason for a social worker to conduct a assessment of memory, orientation, and judgment. Also, social worker must assess each minor with a mental impairment for PS based on individual need. In doing so, the social worker must request the parent or guardian to obtain available information and documentation about a minor's mental impairment, including other agency records like those from regional center, with the written consent of parents or appropriate persons, and then review such information and documentation. A county is not required to independently obtain such information and documentation, but they must ask a parent or guardian to do so. And the last piece, which I think is extremely important, and we'll explain exactly what it means in this presentation, a minor must not be denied PS based solely on age. So in 2015, the California Department of Social Services introduced another all-county letter, 25, which is a update based upon the Garrett rules for assessing children for protective supervision. And in doing so, they created a 4-step process, which we've discussed, I believe, in the past. It has to do with the fact that the first step is that the child be determined to be non-self-directing. Second step is the child have the mobility to put themselves in harm's need. Third is that the recipient require a significantly higher level of supervision based on the mental impairment than another child who does not have a mental impairment. And number 4 is that the need be 24 hours, that the child require 24-hour supervision in order to remain safely in the home. But the all-county letter 1525 also clarifies some of the Garrett rules, indicates that their social worker is required to assess all eligible minors for mental impairment, mental illness, and request the parents or guardians obtain available information and documentation about the existence of a minor's mental impairment, mental illness, evaluate a mentally ill, mentally impaired minor in functions of memory, orientation, and judgment on individualized basis, evaluate a mentally ill, mentally impaired minor even if there are no previous injuries, and evaluate a mentally ill, mentally impaired minor regardless of age. Why is this important? Why is it important that there is a distinction between all-county letter 1525 and the Garrett 98-87 all-county letter? Well, the reason is that at the time in 1998, there was common practice for social workers not to even do assessments. And now, in 2015, a rule was essentially clarified that stated that yes, a social worker could find that there is an individual who is, say, for example, age 3, and does require or does exhibit non-self-direction, but is the non-self-direction significantly higher in order to warrant protective supervision? And so based upon the rules clarification in 2015, whereas back in 1998 social workers would simply not assess at all, well, now the rule is that after assessing and after looking at all the documentation, the social worker still has the ability to deny based partly on age. In other words, they're still making a finding that the individual is non-self-directing, but the non-self-direction does not result in a significantly greater need for protective supervision than a typical child of the same age.